Hi again. Today's book is the second to be written by this author, and it is in some ways it's a follow-up to his previous book, and it's this book, London's Armed Police, Up Close and Personal by Stephen Smith. And of course, his previous book was Stop Armed Police, this one, which, as I said when I was talking about it, was really a very similar format to a previous book written on London's Armed Police. His second book, this one, is takes us right up to date. It was written in published in 2019. Brings us up to date as regards the incidents, armed incidents, and so on. So that's a section of the book. It covers the armed robberies and working with flying squad and so on that had happened, but also the major terrorist incidents that happened since the previous book. There was a lot of Islamic terrorist attacks in London, and there were marauding terrorist vehicle attacks, marauding terrorist weapon attacks. And he goes into them in detail. One of them being the Westminster Bridge attack, where an Islamic terrorist, Masood, drove his vehicle through the crowd on Westminster Bridge, killing and injuring a lot of people, drove to the gates of Parliament, and then attacked the police officer on duty. It was an unarmed officer, Keith Palmer, who, even though he was wearing a Kevlar vest, the frenzied knife attack targeted areas that were vulnerable. So there was a lot surrounding this attack, lessons learned, and so on, and things that arose from it. The terrorist, after killing the unarmed officer who was guarding the gate, moved towards the palace grounds itself, and was confronted by two protection officers who had dropped off the Ministry of Defence and were waiting by his vehicle. And they realised what was happening, and one of them opened fire 3 shots and killed the attacker. So it's one of the rare times when a protection officer's opened fire. It showed weaknesses in the protection of Parliament, which in the aftermath, where the diplomatic protection group's remit was to protect the perimeter, but MPs protested about the overt armed presence. So it was gradually reduced, and with fatal and tragic consequences. A bright point was that one of the MPs refused to be herded to safety. He was a former army officer, Tobias Elwood, and he did his best to render first aid to the injured officer. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful. He died in hospital, but well done to that MP. And there was another less salubrious implication where a temporary commissioner, assistant commissioner, I think, was in his car and stopped at the gates and didn't get out of his vehicle to intervene in any way. So that was a black mark, really, there. So there was that. There was Borough Market, where the ARVs rolled really quickly. Again, it was marauding terrorist edge weapon attack. And the thing about modern times is a lot of these incidents are on video. So you can actually see the armed officers going into action themselves. So the book then goes on to talk about uh, changes in equipment. Uh, the Met went from, well, the specialist firearms officers went from the MP5 to the, and interchangeable with the HK53. They then put the two together really by going to the HK36, which was 5.56 weapon. But they didn't have that for very long, and they've now gone to the SIG rifle, and in various forms. And obviously every time they do this, it requires retraining, different pouches and stuff. But there must be an upside to it. These weapons must be so much better than the previous one. Equipment certainly changed over the years. I came out of a restaurant in Liverpool. It was a hot summer's day, and there was an ARV parked, and the ARV crewman was standing on the pavement, and he was really perspiring under all the kit he was carrying. At a glance, I couldn't tell you how many communication devices he had, and lots of, a taser, handgun. He didn't have a long gun. And a few days later, I was in Berlin, and I passed a police officer there who just had a pistol. It didn't even have armor, and the contrast was really quite stark. Different roles, obviously. The Berlin officer is a patrol officer who has a firearm all the time. ARVs are specifically go to armed incidents. But the guys in the ARVs have got more kit on them now than the team who went into the Iranian embassy. So one of the things also in the book is he talks a lot about training. Mr. Smith was involved in training at various phases in his career, and it's a big topic and how the training improved. I would say that I really wish that even though they do many, many, many more weeks training than they did before, there's still something lacking in the safety sometimes. Because all the training is common. They have these firearm centres, so they're all trained to the same standard. And there was during one of the terrorist alerts in Liverpool, our specialist firearms team was on the streets, and I noticed one of the officers. He had a 36, and he was talking to a man and his little boy, and he was pointing the muzzle at the child's head. So rule 2, I don't care who you are, I don't care what your designation is, rule 2 still applies. So the book then goes into what you call the different roles and the different sections, the part called the specialists. And they came up with counter-terrorist specialist firearms officers a while ago. I think it was just before the Olympics. I think it was in preparation for the Olympics. Counter-terrorist. And there's a big section on that. It did start with the Olympics. They did a kind of brought teams from everywhere and then trained them all to a high standard. And then they kind of kept that standard later on for the highly specialist teams in the major forces. Yeah, it doesn't actually say exactly the length of the course, but I think it's something like 12 weeks. Very, very high level training. So that's the highest level. One of the things that happened was all firearms training was lifted, and a lot of it came as a result of the Mumbai attacks. There was lessons learned, and one of the things that was looked at was that it's likely to be a routinely armed officer who first encounters such an attack, this surprise attack in a city. So the officers who were formerly just on protection duties and static guarding and things like that with a firearm, previously never really had specific training in room combat and that kind of thing. They had a level of it, but it wasn't to a high degree of tactical proficiency. And this was changed, and equipment and training for all officers who are armed now, they should be able to really take that frontline role in coping with a terrorist attack. So that's been reflected throughout. So some of the other specialist roles that that the book covers: hostage rescue, obviously, aircraft intervention, and sniper. Also armed protection, the what we call a bodyguard role, really. Let me just see this. Yeah, this is some of the advanced training that's going on. It's, as you can see from the glimpses I've given you of the book, it's very, very heavily illustrated. A lot of the pictures in colour. It's very detailed. It's very much a view from the inside. And really, it shows what a fantastic resource the armed police have been, particularly in the Met, where they do encounter more incidents than in any other part of the UK, and in some ways more than in many parts of Europe. So they are really at the sharp end, and the book really does give you a really great insight into that, and it's one I would recommend.